A few months ago, I finished playing Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, and I couldn't help but feel a bit disappointed by it. While there's a lot to praise when it comes to gameplay and side content, it also has one of the weakest storylines in the entire series, and in this video I'm going to be examining its many issues. There will be spoilers for all of Infinite Wealth, so I'd recommend closing the video if you want to avoid those. And if you want to just skip around the video, then there will be timestamps in the description below. But before I get into the plot issues I consider major, I'll first be talking about some of the smaller issues, and I'll start by talking about how this game handles romance. Infinite Wealth has two romantic subplots, specifically Sanhee being in love with Kiryu and Ichiban being in love with Sayako. And one of my issues with these subplots is that they just kind of come out of nowhere, as the previous game gave no hints of Ichiban or Sanhee's romantic interests. Although there is a big difference in how important each of these subplots are. Sanhee's feelings are one-sided and mostly relegated to optional conversations. Ichiban's relationship with Sayako is far more important, with a significant chunk of the first chapter being dedicated to their romance. But my main issue is how the romance is handled past the first chapter. Ichiban will rarely address it since he's so busy with everything else going on, and the little screen time Sayako is given is almost solely focused on her relationship with Ichiban, giving her a lot less agency as a character. It is brought back in the ending sequence, where it seems like Ichiban has developed as a person and is finally able to properly confess his feelings. But ultimately, it's just used for the sake of a joke, where Ichiban is just as bad as confessing as he was at the start of the game. I found this scene funny when I watched it, but in retrospect it kind of bothers me. It could have been a good moment of character growth, but it's completely undermined for the sake of a joke. Besides these romantic subplots coming out of nowhere, Infinite Wealth fails to justify their existence, making them feel completely unnecessary. Another relatively minor issue I had was with the treatment of Sawashiro. Sawashiro was one of my favorite characters from Yakuza 7, and I was really interested in seeing where his story would go following the death of his son. The first few chapters of Infinite Wealth give the impression that Sawashiro is going to be very important, but he ends up being severely underutilized. I'm not sure how most people feel about the retcon of Hoshino's death, but I thought that it was surprisingly well done. It gave more context for Sawashiro's depression and why he chose to tip off Ichiban. In a series with a lot of poorly handled retcons, this is one of the few that actually made sense. But unfortunately, the rest of the game doesn't really explore his character. We get the impression that he might be on Ebina's side, but it turns out that Sawashiro was actually plotting against him. But then he gets caught and tortured by Ebina, basically becoming a damsel in distress for the game's final chapter. I feel like Sawashiro's relationship with Ebina could have been a great opportunity to explore both of these characters, but almost all of it happens off screen. While Infinite Wealth doesn't do anything to ruin Sawashiro, he is severely underutilized for how much his involvement was hyped up. Also, this is more of a nitpick, but I find it funny that we don't see what happens to Sawashiro after he wakes up, as if the group just forgot he existed and left him at Millennium Tower. Considering that one of the group's main objectives was to rescue Sawashiro, I feel like we could have at least gotten a moment where he was escorted out of the building. But now that I've discussed some of my smaller problems, I'm going to discuss the issues that had more of a significant effect. And I'll start by talking about Kiryu's cancer. Soon after playing Gaiden, I heard that Kiryu gets diagnosed with cancer in Infinite Wealth. And since Gaiden made a point of showing Kiryu's smoking addiction, you'd think that this would be the cause of his cancer, which could have been a really effective way to demonstrate the effects of his unhealthy mental state. But instead, Infinite Wealth reveals that Kiryu started working a job at a nuclear waste facility to make money for the orphanage. orphanage. And due to a workplace accident, he ended up being exposed to low-level radiation. This explanation doesn't really make sense, since Kiryu has never been shown to do jobs like this under the Daidoji, and I have a very hard time understanding why the Daidoji would allow this knowing the risks. The writers literally had the perfect justification for Kiryu's cancer, but instead they decide to give this contrived explanation for how he got it. I've seen some people point out how the doctor didn't confirm if the cancer was caused by the radiation, and because of that, it still leaves room for the cancer to have been caused by Kiryu's smoking. But if this flashback isn't meant to be an explanation for why Kiryu has cancer, then why even include it in the first place? At best, this is a red herring, and at worst, it's a more contrived explanation for why Kiryu has cancer. Considering that Kiryu's cancer is one of the most important plot points of the game, it deserves a much more concrete explanation than what we got. But even looking past this whole plot point of Kiryu's cancer, Infinite Wealth as a whole feels surprisingly disconnected from Gaiden, and almost every aspect of this dissonance revolves around the Daidoji faction. While the Daidoji faction in Gaiden was very poorly written, they were still established to be a legitimate threat, where Kiryu is forced to hide his identity and work under their thumbs so they don't kill his family. Infinite Wealth, on the other hand, depicts them as much less strict. They don't really care about Kiryu telling people who he is, or letting random people in on Daidoji operations. While the Daidoji have always done a bad job at maintaining confidentiality, they at least pretended to care about it in Gaiden. But in Infinite Wealth, they don't even do that. Even when his identity is exposed on the internet, he still faces no repercussions from the Daidoji. They also seem to put a lot less effort into security, since their safe house in Hawaii was ambushed without Hanawa or anyone else being able to anticipate it. And up until Hanawa's death, the Daidoji seemed completely unaware of Eiji's past with the Arakawa family, which could have tipped them off about Eiji's true intentions. Another plot point that didn't make sense was the whole thing with the nuclear waste facility. I already alluded to this in the previous section, but we've never seen Kiryu do any jobs like this in Gaiden. From what we knew, Kiryu was basically a secret agent for the Daidoji, and that they would financially support the orphanage for as long as Kiryu works with them. But apparently they stopped doing this in Gaiden, since Kiryu now has to do odd jobs in order to support the orphanage. As if the Daidoji weren't already a weak plot point, Infinite Wealth makes them even more inconsistent. And I'm aware that there's a certain amount of dissonance between every Yakuza game, but I find the lack of continuity between Gaiden and Infinite Wealth to be especially frustrating, since Gaiden was meant to bridge the gaps between these most recent entries. My next issue is how this game treats the characters of Hanawa and Wong Tou. Based on his role in Gaiden, Hanawa seemed like he was going to be a very important character from here on out, being a member of the Daidoji who has also gained a close bond with Kiryu. But in Infinite Wealth, he not only becomes a plot device, but is noticeably less friendly towards Kiryu, more or less invalidating their relationship from Gaiden. Wong Tou, on the other hand, is introduced in Infinite Wealth, and he gets a really strong introduction that reveals many different aspects of his character. This gave the impression that Wong Tou was also going to be a very important character from here on out. Yet both of these characters are killed off in Chapter 9, which I would already have a problem with even if their deaths felt more earned narratively, but they both end up dying in the most unceremonious way possible, getting shot by a couple of random thugs. I also take issue with how Hanawa is completely unarmed right before his death, even though he carried around a baton back in Gaiden, and all the Daidoji in Infinite Wealth are shown to have firearms. We know that Hanawa isn't much of a fighter, and considering that his group is currently isolated from the rest of the Daidoji, he should at least be taking some precautions for his own safety. It's yet another example of the Daidoji being depicted as incompetent for no good reason. One last issue I want to bring up isn't completely related to the death scene, but I find it bizarre how the kidnapping of Wong Tou's son is treated by the story. story. It's taken seriously while Wong Tou is still alive, but everyone seems to forget about it after he dies, and it's only brought up again in the final chapter, where Ichiban's party just happens to be in the same location as his son. It feels like one of the many plot points the writers forgot about until the final chapter. I just find it frustrating that RGG would hype up the importance of these two characters, only to kill them off in the most disrespectful ways. At least Sawashiro is still alive to show up in later games, but unless RGG pulls out a dumb plot twist to bring back Hanawa or Wong Tou, it seems like their characters have gone completely wasted. Another missed opportunity is how Infinite Wealth handles the return of Kiryu's Yakuza friends, which I find to be frustrating for a couple of reasons. Kiryu insulting his friends for running away from their problems comes across as unusually cold for him, but it also makes him seem like a massive hypocrite as he's berating his friends for doing the exact same thing he's done throughout the series. And the fact that none of Kiryu's friends call him out on this makes no sense. It could have been the perfect moment for Kiryu to confront one of his greatest character flaws. And while it might not have been enough to completely fix this scene, it would have made the return of these characters a lot more meaningful. But once the fight is over, Kiryu reveals that he intentionally provoked his friends so they could have one last fight, which honestly makes him look even worse. Majima, Saejima, and Daigo are clearly guilty about the current state of the Yakuza, and the fact that Kiryu's provocations were partially driven by this desire makes him come across as a lot more selfish. And once Kiryu's friends return later in the game, there's no moment of reconciliation or Kiryu owning up to his mistakes. They just agreed to help Kiryu out and leave it at that. This plot point had the potential to be a big moment of growth for Kiryu's character, but in the end, it seems like its only purpose was to have Kiryu fight alongside his friends again. When these characters aren't being disrespected by Kiryu, their inclusion in 8 comes across as surface level fan service, as they don't add much of value to the story or Kiryu's character development. It's possible that they'll be more important in future installments, since there's a lot of plot threads in this game that are left wide open, but their roles in this game specifically felt pretty unnecessary. If you couldn't tell already, Infinite Wealth depends on a lot of contrivances and clumsy writing in order for its story to progress, and one of the best examples of this is with Tatara Channel. I did find the introduction of Tatara Channel pretty funny due to the absurdity of it, but the comedic element got pretty old due to how many times it's brought up, and there's so many plot points related to it that just don't make sense. A large part of Ebina's plan relies on no one noticing Tatara Channel's blatant hypocrisy, where she is demonizing ex-Yakuza to ruin their lives while also supporting the largest Yakuza organization in the country. This could be an extension of Infinite Wealth's depiction of cancel culture, where people are blindly accepting these narratives without really thinking about anything. And I don't have trouble believing that there are people like this, especially with a channel as large as Tatara. But with hypocrisy this blatant, there's going to be some sort of backlash. Yet Infinite Wealth would lead the player to believe that there was no significant backlash against Tatara Channel. There's also a small detail in chapter 12 that I really take issue with, where it's revealed that the random truck driver recorded Kiryu's conversation with his Yakuza friends and sent the video to Tatara in order to further tarnish his reputation. This might have been fine if the driver recorded them from a distance, but he is very clearly standing outside of the hut's window, where Majima should have been able to spot him. It also makes me wonder what the rest of Kiryu's party were doing this entire time. Despite them also being outside of the hut, none of them noticed the driver getting out of his truck to spy on Kiryu. While this isn't exactly an issue with Tatara Channel itself, I still found it pretty glaring and wanted to point it out. A more related issue is how no one was able to figure out that Chitose is Tatara. With how powerful the Daidoji are supposed to be in Japan, they shouldn't have had trouble accessing Chitose's internet activity. Another faction that should have been able able to figure this out is the Gomijul. It's been established that they can hack into satellites, yet they make no attempt to figure out a VTuber's identity. There's also the fact that Chitose was able to log back onto Tatara Channel, even though Eiji has been controlling it throughout the entire story. It's never explained how she regained control of it or why she didn't do so earlier, as she could have prevented Eiji from ruining any more lives. It's also questionable how Chitose was able to start streaming from the bottom of Nele Island. It has been established that there's some internet connection on this island, since Bryce was able to have a Zoom call with the people he's working with, but it's never explained how Chitose got access to it. But even if this was explained, it doesn't explain how she has a connection this strong with how deep she is underground. Unless the Wi-Fi range extends to the top secret nuclear waste room, which I can think of no good reason for, Chitose should either have a very spotty connection or none at all. If she just recorded the room as a regular video and decided to post it later, then this problem would have easily been fixed. The plot point of Tatara Channel just gets worse the more you think about it. It doesn't work as a commentary on cancel culture, and it makes for some nonsensical moments of writing. And since I'm talking about Tatara Channel, I think that now would be a good time to talk about Chitose herself. While I wouldn't consider Chitose to be badly written, I think the Tatara subplot has a very negative effect on her character. The main problem is her explanation for how Eiji blackmailed her into doing what he wants. Considering that she ruined the lives of many people and endangered the entire party, Eiji must have had some massive leverage over her, and it's explained that Eiji threatened to expose Chitose's identity to the world, also mentioning his connections to the Yakuza in order to threaten her life. This would likely bring a lot of trouble to Chitose, so I understand why she did Eiji's bidding before she befriends Ichiban. But the problem is that after she befriends Ichiban, she takes way too long to warn him about Eiji, making her largely responsible for the abduction of Lonnie, along with the deaths of Hanawa and Wong Tou. Chitose knew that she was putting all of them in danger, yet she chooses not to warn them until it's too late. There's also the fact that she faces barely any repercussions for her actions. When she reveals Pelicana's secrets in the final chapter, she also chooses to reveal her identity as the owner of Tatara Channel, showing that she's finally taking accountability for what she has done. And it would be logical to assume that Chitose would be in huge trouble following this live stream, but based on the final cutscenes, it doesn't seem like she's in any trouble. She's even become the chairwoman of her family's company, even though I highly doubt that her family would give her this position. Not only did Chitose expose the Fujinomiya company in the past, but she just exposed Pelicana's nuclear waste project, which the Fujinomiya company provided ships for. The company should be facing significant backlash due to Chitose's actions, which makes it very hard to understand why they would let her become chairwoman. Chitose says that she mended things with her family off screen, but with how terrible her family has been established as, we're given no reason for why they would change this suddenly. This also invalidates Chitose's sacrifice in the final chapter, where she's being rewarded for her actions rather than facing any major consequences, which also weakens the whole theme of accountability this game explores. There's also another plot point with Chitose that has a similar issue, specifically her getting Ichiban drunk, stealing his belongings, and leaving him naked on a beach so he can get arrested. When the two reunite in chapter 4, Chitose explains her reasoning for doing this. According to her, she was working for Akane as a part-timer, which is illegal due to her being a transfer student. Soon after Akane's disappearance, Chitose arrived at Akane's house to collect her paycheck, which was when Ichiban arrived at the house. house, so she wanted to get rid of him before he could get the wrong idea and called the police, which seems understandable at first, but the problem is that's meant to justify her leaving Ichiban naked on the beach, at least until her connection to Eiji is fully explained. Chitose says that Ichiban would have been too focused on protecting himself to track her down. Ichiban jokingly says that's one way to do it, and then the conversation continues like normal. This was an awful thing for Chitose to do, yet it's almost being played for laughs at this point. But what makes it even worse is that the game treats this as legitimate reasoning for what she did. It's brushed over almost instantly, and none of the party members will really hold this against her. But then the plot point is recontextualized in chapter 11, where Ichiban and Chitose's meeting was actually planned by Eiji. He told Chitose to get close to Ichiban, who he believed would be the first person to track down Akane. But since Chitose cared about Akane, she intentionally tried to get Ichiban arrested in order to protect Akane from Eiji. So now the story is trying to frame Chitose's actions as noble, even though she was still screwing over an innocent person. Overall, Chitose doesn't face nearly enough personal consequences for her actions, and the fact that her actions in this example aren't viewed as critically only adds to the issue. But now I'll start talking about Infinite Wealth's main antagonists. After how good the villains have been in the last few games, Infinite Wealth's villains fall noticeably short, and the first one I'll be talking about is Bryce. Out of all the main antagonists, I have the least amount of criticisms for Bryce, which feels weird to say because he's probably the weakest one of the game. After the game spends so much time setting up Bryce and his influence over Waikiki, his motivations are much deeper than wanting power, which isn't inherently a weak motivation, but Bryce's character lacks any depth besides this desire for power. I also find it weird that in the final cutscenes, none of the characters seem to be worried about Bryce. With how powerful he's been established as throughout Infinite Wealth, he should still be considered a massive threat. Even if he goes to prison and loses his political power, there are still countless Palekana members who would give their lives for him. The characters should still be concerned about what Bryce will do next, yet none of them even acknowledge this as a possibility. But anyways, that's pretty much all I have to say about Bryce. He's a pretty dull character that pales in comparison to previous villains, but I also don't have that much to criticize about him. On the other hand, a villain who I do have a lot of criticisms for is Ebina. I feel like Ebina had the potential to be one of the great Yakuza villains, but his character falls short in many areas. My first issue with Ebina is the explanation for how he exists. We learn in Yakuza 7 that when Arakawa was still part of the Hikawa family, he was forced into a relationship with Hikawa's daughter Yuriko, and since Arakawa didn't really love her, he started dating Akane in secret, and were given no reason to believe that there was anything more to his relationship with Yuriko. But we then learn in Infinite Wealth that Arakawa secretly had a child with Yuriko, who ends up being none other than Ebina. This feels really out of character for Arakawa, since we're given no reason to believe that he would cheat on someone he genuinely loves. The reason why Sawashiro's retcon worked so well is that simply elaborated on aspects of his character that we already knew about, providing a bit more context for his actions in 7. But with Arakawa, this aspect of his character was never hinted at up until this point. The reveal that Ebina is Arakawa's son is not only a contrived way to give this character more importance, but it doesn't even make sense with what we know about Arakawa. But the far bigger issue with Ebina's character is how underutilized he is by the story. Not only does Ebina have very little screen time, but most of the scenes he's in tells us very little about him. He appears to be very calm and collected, and only shows positive intentions when it comes to what he's doing for the Yakuza. But when rewatching these scenes with later context, we get almost no hints to Ebina's true intentions. This could be indicative of how good Ebina is at manipulation, but I see this as a big missed opportunity, since these scenes could have provided more hints to what Ebina truly wants. And ignoring these brief scenes, is, Ebina remains absent for most of the story. There are a handful of scenes where the character talk about Ebina's plan, but his actual motives are barely touched upon. The first time where we see Ebina demonstrate his hatred of the Yakuza is in the final chapter, where he kills Narasaki and sets the Seiryu clan building on fire. But a huge problem with this scene is that we don't learn why Ebina killed Narasaki. At first I thought it was out of frustration due to Narasaki representing what Ebina hates about the Yakuza, but that doesn't feel like a sufficient explanation when considering the risks Ebina took. Setting the Seiryu clan HQ on fire should be a very big deal. Not only would it be massive news due to the Seiryu clan's relevance, but it would also be of concern to the Seiryu clan themselves. Seeing that Narasaki was a high-ranking Seiryu member, I doubt that the clan would do nothing in response to his death. It would either make the clan suspicious of Ebina since he was the last person Narasaki talked to, or make them believe that another group is waging war with them. What Ebina did in this scene should have had massive ramifications, yet the Seiryu clan burning down is only mentioned in a throwaway line, and when looking at all these potential consequences, this seems unusually reckless for Ebina, as he took a massive risk that would only serve to sabotage his plan. And that brings us to the confrontation at Millennium Tower, where we get a 13-minute cutscene to explain Ebina's entire character. He provides the party an explanation of his master plan, which partially makes sense, but also has some massive issues. I've already mentioned how the plan relies on no one noticing Tatara Channel's hypocrisy, but there's also a more fundamental issue with this plan. Ebina knew that Bryce's nuclear waste project was doomed for failure, and that the truth would eventually be made public. But Ebina's plan is to imprison ex-Yakuza on Nele Island for the rest of their lives, which he wouldn't be able to do if Bryce's crimes were exposed. If he believed that the nuclear waste project wouldn't last, then he should have made more of an effort to prevent that from happening. Ebina also spells out the ways his character parallels Ichiban. While Ichiban idolized Arakawa and wants to help the Yakuza rehabilitate, Ebina hates Arakawa and wants to make the Yakuza suffer. Even by Yakuza standards, this monologue comes across as extremely on the nose, with Ebina even referring to himself in the third person. But this monologue might have been more forgivable if it wasn't one of the only scenes to touch upon these parallels. I also want to mention the detail of Ebina having a back tattoo. Considering how much he hates Yakuza, I find it interesting that he got a back tattoo when he probably didn't need to. It could be used to symbolize how Ebina is completely consumed by vengeance, that he's become no better than the Yakuza who he wants revenge on. And it's a really interesting idea for a Yakuza villain, but the problem is that none of this is explored beyond the surface level. A character as conflicted as Ebina needed way more time to develop his emotional state, as his lack of development makes him difficult to understand or sympathize with. The last plot point I want to mention is Ebina's choice to not kill Sawashiro, as Ebina doesn't provide any explanation for why he did this. The only reason Ebina needed Sawashiro was so he could lure Kiryu to Millennium Tower, but after that he has no reason to keep him alive. During the final scene at Survive, some of the group are having trouble figuring out why Ebina did this. Zhao then tries to explain Ebina's reasoning, and it took me rewatching this scene a couple times to understand what he was even saying. He says that Ebina was probably hoping that someone would come along to reassure him, which is likely referring to Kiryu, but that still doesn't explain why he kept Sawashiro alive. Like I said, Ebina only needed Sawashiro to lure Kiryu to Millennium Tower. He could have easily killed him before the party showed up. This also creates the implication that Ebina intentionally sabotaged his plan at the last moment. Up until the final chapter, Ebina has been shown to be solely dedicated to his cause, dedicating everything he has to getting revenge on the Yakuza. Yet we're supposed to believe that he would sabotage his plan right before he succeeds, all so he could have a heart-to-heart with Kiryu. But what makes it even worse is that none of this is treated as a definitive explanation, as none of the party members really know why Ebina did this. And I find this lack of explanation decision to be really frustrating, since we're not given enough context for why Ebina would contradict an important part of his character. I'm not saying that there's no possible reason, but the game needed to provide more of a concrete explanation to prevent this plot point from feeling contrived. Overall, I find Ebina's character to be extremely disappointing. There's plenty of aspects of his character that had potential, but they aren't given nearly enough time to be fleshed out. And there's still a couple of scenes where he acts in contradictory ways, making his character a lot more inconsistent. But even with all the issues Ebina's character has, I find the most frustrating villain of this game to be Eiji. Eiji's character has a lot of similarities to Ebina, but somehow is handled even worse by Infinite Wealth's story. My first issue is how Eiji's backstory informs his hatred of the Yakuza. While Ebina lost his mother at a young age, Eiji was framed for a crime by the Arakawa family and lost his job soon after. It makes sense why Eiji would hate Yakuza after this event and even join Bleach Japan, but it doesn't explain why his hatred is as extreme as Ebina's, especially considering that Eiji was an adult when he was framed by the Arakawa family. There's also a lot of dissonance with how this backstory informs Eiji's actions. Even though Eiji hates the Yakuza, he's perfectly fine with working for someone like Bryce, who's far worse than most Yakuza out there. He also views himself as morally superior to Yakuza, even though he's pretty awful himself. Not only is he perfectly fine with kidnapping and traumatizing an innocent child, but he even seemed to enjoy doing it. He reaches levels of sadism that give some of the most vile Yakuza characters a run for their money. And the only reason we're given for why he's like this is because the Yakuza ruined his career. But even if Eiji's character is poorly informed and his willingness to work with Bryce doesn't make sense, the biggest issue with his character comes with the game's ending, specifically the scene where Ichiban reunites with Eiji. Like a lot of the plot points I've mentioned in this video, there are some decent ideas here, but the problem lies in the execution. The first problem happens before the scene itself, as we're not given a clear explanation for why Eiji is in his current situation. The last time we saw him, he was still in Hawaii working for Bryce, but in the final chapter, he's back in Japan for some reason. I don't believe that it was a reaction to Chitose's live stream, because Eiji looks like he's in the exact same state as Ichiban finds him in. But even if that was the case, it still doesn't make sense that Eiji would go back to Japan. With how influential Tatara Channel is, I feel like he would be in more trouble there than he would in Hawaii. But also, we don't get a proper explanation for Eiji's injuries. Whether they were injured by the mob surrounding his building or one of the gangsters he was working with. It may seem like a small detail, but I'd say it's pretty important since it leads to Ichiban carrying Eiji to the police station, creating very clear parallels with Ichiban's relationship to Masato. I imagine this parallel was included to evoke some emotional impact, but that impact is largely diminished since the story doesn't set it up properly. It wouldn't even be a difficult thing to answer, yet Eiji is unclear about who exactly injured his legs. But like most people who don't like this scene, my biggest issue is with how Ichiban treats Eiji. I don't take issue with Ichiban wanting Eiji to atone for his actions. That part makes sense to me. But it's everything else about this scene that I have a problem with. One of the biggest missteps was pushing the narrative that there was actually a strong friendship between Ichiban and Eiji. That even with all the terrible things Eiji has done to Ichiban, those happy moments between them were still real. But the game has given us no reason to believe that any of those early interactions with Eiji were genuine. He admitted to putting on an act the entire time, to the point that he temporarily crippled himself so he could remind Ichiban of Masato. You can't even say that they had a long-lasting relationship since it only lasted for a couple days. This scene also wants us to believe that Eiji still shows potential for redemption, but prior to the scene, we've seen no redeeming aspects of his character. Eiji's kind personality is revealed to be a complete facade, and after he betrays the group, we learn that he's one of the most sadistic characters in the series. While Ichiban is an unusual unusually forgiving person. His forgiveness was always driven by his ability to see the good in other people. If you look at every instance of Ichiban forgiving someone in Yakuza 7, there's always some positive aspects to their character that Ichiban is able to spot. Even Infinite Wealth was mostly consistent with this characterization, whether it was noticing Tomizawa's hesitation to shoot him, or pointing out Sawashiro's allegiance to Arakawa. But with Eiji, there are no character traits that could be considered redeemable. I've seen people argue that he forgave Masato despite him also doing awful things, but that comparison only works if you ignore the context of 7's ending. Ichiban's relationship with Eiji lasted a couple of days, while his relationship with Masato lasted years, which is why despite Masato being a terrible person, Ichiban still views him as a brother and wants to save him. Masato was by far one of the most important people in Ichiban's life, and Infinite Wealth wants us to believe that he would show similar treatment to someone he only knew for a few days. And even though Eiji hasn't really done anything to redeem himself besides agreeing to go to jail, Ichiban already goes back to treating him as a friend, saying that Eiji can come to him whenever he's feeling down. It's one thing if Ichiban wants to give Eiji a chance at redemption, but he's already acting like Eiji has redeemed himself when he hasn't actually done anything. Since my first playthrough of Infinite Wealth, I've gone from liking this scene to thinking it's one of the worst parts of the game. We're not given a good reason to believe that Eiji will improve as a person, since we see no redeeming aspects of his character, and Ichiban genuinely feels like a parody of himself, where his ability to find the good in people has transformed into blind forgiveness of anyone who's nice to him. It's yet another payoff that sounds interesting on paper, but is completely unearned narratively, and it's one of the reasons I considered this game's ending a massive disappointment. The only plot point I may be more disappointed by is how this game concludes Kiryu's story. While it isn't nearly as poorly written as some of these other plot points, I still consider it one of Infinite Wealth's biggest missed opportunities. As I mentioned in the section with Kiryu's Yakuza friends, I feel like a lot more could have been done to explore Kiryu's hypocrisy, especially since his storyline is supposed to be about coming to terms with his past actions. But what I consider an even bigger issue is the ending scene, where Kiryu decides to get treatment for his cancer, reveal to Haruka that he's still alive, and start using his real name again. This could have been a genuinely great ending to Kiryu's story, but there are multiple problems that lead to it feeling unearned narratively. The most obvious issue with this scene goes back to the Daidoji. Since Kiryu is no longer hiding his identity, it feels safe to assume that he's no longer under the Daidoji's thumb. But while the Daidoji have become much less strict in this game, we're given no indication that Kiryu can just leave the faction whenever he wants. And when taking into account the events of Gaiden, Kiryu being able to leave this easily makes even less sense. But even if we ignore this glaring inconsistency, narratively it kind of comes out of nowhere. Throughout the game, we've seen Kiryu at an emotional low point where he doesn't even want treatment to potentially cure his cancer. We even see this right before the final boss, where Ebina refers to their fight as Kiryu Kazuma's final stand, and Kiryu responds that he was thinking the same thing, which clearly implies that Kiryu was planning to die here. Yet we're supposed to believe that after all of this, he's suddenly regained his will to live. He hasn't gone through any sort of character arc that would change his mind, yet we're just supposed to expect that this is what he wants now. This ending would have been so easy not to screw up, yet the writers forgot to give Kiryu a reason for why he changes his mind. Infinite Wealth was the perfect opportunity to finally give Kiryu a good ending, and the writers fumbled it significantly. I guess it's preferable to 6's ending, where Kiryu completely regresses as a character, but that's really the only praise I can give Kiryu's ending in 8. As I've said earlier, there are things to praise about Infinite Wealth, but when looking at the plot, it's riddled with problems. It has a similar issue to Yakuza's 4 and 5, where the writers set up incredibly ambitious storylines with multiple moving parts, but are unable to connect all these different plot points without contrivances or characters acting out of character. But what I consider the greatest issue with Infinite Wealth is its emphasis on theme, which not only comes at the cost of its story and characters, but have countless issues in terms of their execution. The story of Infinite Wealth is not only a waste of potential, but a perfect example of the biggest writing problems with the Yakuza series. And I'm worried that after the massive success of Infinite Wealth, that the writers won't learn from their mistakes and proceed to write more stories like this. I still haven't completely lost faith in RGG since they've put out a lot of great games in recent years with a lot of improvements when it comes to writing, and I can only hope that as time goes on, we'll get more stories like Yakuza 7 or Lost Judgment, and less stories like Infinite Wealth. But anyways, that's it for my Infinite Wealth analysis. I've put a lot of work into writing it since I feel very strongly about this game, and I hope that you enjoyed watching it. If you think that there was anything I missed or got wrong, then feel free to let me know in the comments. But anyways, that's about it. Thanks for watching.